I'm Dr. Kate Smith, and I'm Deputy Head of the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice here on the Gold Coast. And this is a really great event. It's really topical, and we've got Max to thank for it. Max is one of our first-year students, and about 2 months ago, he sent me an email to say, can somebody tell me what's going on in the Middle East? And we sought the expert advice. And Halim, we're very lucky to have Halim Rain here today. He's from the School of Humanities, but has written widely on Islamic and Muslim issues. I think we're going to keep it reasonably informal. So if you have questions as we go along, I think, Halim, you're happy to take them. Probably it'll last about an hour, hour and a quarter, hour and a half, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions afterwards. Okay, enjoy. Halim.
Thanks, Kate. Good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me well enough? Excellent. Okay. So today, when I was invited to come and give this presentation, it was pitched around, what's happening with ISIS and Iraq and the Middle East and all that sort of thing. But I think there's a base level of knowledge we need to get across. There's a bigger picture here that we need to be able to see in order to have an informed understanding of, what's going on in the Middle East and around these kinds of issues that we're seeing in the media today. So what I'm going to speak about is Jihads, Caliphates and Muslim groups in a general sense. I'll begin by talking about Jihad, and I'll talk about, what does this concept mean according to the Quran, the holy book of Muslims. And then I'll talk a little bit about how the concept has evolved over time through the era of the Muslim empires, into the colonial and the post-colonial period, into modern times with the militant groups that we've become familiar with today. And I'll talk a little bit about why these militant jihadist groups emerge in the first place. Then we'll move on to talk about caliphates, this supposed system of Muslim government that a number of different groups are advocating today. We'll talk about the use of that term or that concept in the Quran, and then we'll move into talking about how that developed in respect to Muslim empires over the 1,000 or so, 1,500 years of Islamic history. Then we'll have a look at this concept of caliphate as a doctrine and talk about how it developed and how it came to be assumed to be part of the Islamic system, or the so-called Islamic system. And then we'll have a look at some contemporary movements, including ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hizb ut-Tahrir, and others that advocate this particular system of government. But I think what's important then is to move on from that and talk about the appeal of this kind of the ideas of these groups, and a little bit about why they're able to recruit seemingly so well, particularly among young Western Muslims. So we'll begin by talking about the concept of jihad. Taking the Quran is the holy book of Muslims. It was essentially revealed over a 2-decade period between the year 610 and the year 632. For those of you who don't have a background in this, the Islamic religion follows on after Judaism and then Christianity, and then Islam comes afterwards around the 7th century. The founder of Islam is someone by the name of Muhammad. He's referred to as Muslims as a prophet. Muslims regard him as the last prophet to be sent to humankind. Muslims also recognise previous prophets, Moses, Abraham. They consider Jesus a prophet as well. So Muhammad is born in the city of Mecca, which is in today's modern Saudi Arabia. He was born around the year 570, but is said to have received his first revelation of the Quran around the year 610, when he was about 40 years old. And he continued to receive these revelations according to Islamic teachings over the next 20 years until his death in the year 632. So it's because the Quran contains the essential teachings of Islam, it's the main scripture of the Muslim religion, it's to the Quran that we refer to get an understanding of this concept of jihad. The word itself comes from the root word juhud, which means to strive, struggle, or make an effort. And in the Arabic language, which is the language of the Quran, the language in which the Quran was revealed, the word is used in this sense, striving, struggling, making an effort. And in the Arabic language, Arabs will use it in this way as well. However, from a Westerner's perspective, and from the perspective of many of these militant groups, the word has come to be narrowed to be exclusively about armed struggle. So we'll come to that in a moment. But when looking at the Quran, we can see about 150 verses that talk about war and peace. We also notice that these are revealed in a particular context. They're revealed in the latter half of the life of the Prophet Muhammad when he was at war with the Meccans. The Meccans were idol worshippers. Muhammad was preaching monotheism, or the idea of worshipping one God. Interestingly enough, Muslims use this word Allah, but when they use this word Allah, they're simply using the Arabic word for God. Any of you who have travelled to the Middle East and attended a church sermon in the Middle East would have heard the word Allah. So Arabic-speaking Christians also use the word Allah in reference to God. So when Muslims are using the word Allah, they're not talking about a different God, they're talking about the same God as in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So Muhammad preached monotheism, and this put him at odds with his fellow townsmen in Mecca. Around the year 622, he had to flee Mecca with his companions, and he set up his own, he became a leader of the city of Medina. And it was during this period that a number of battles were fought with the Quraysh tribe. That was the tribe into which Muhammad was born, and this was the tribe that was basically the advocates of polytheism against his monotheistic vision. So the context of the verses that contain the word jihad is this period where Muhammad is already at war with the polytheists of Mecca, the Quraysh tribe. So if we look at the Quran, we can see the word jihad is mentioned about 35 times. The word itself, or one of its grammatical equivalents, is mentioned about 35 times in the Quran. In 4 of those verses, we can explicitly see that it's being used in a militant or combative sense. In 11 of those verses, it's being used in a pacific sense. The word jihad, as I mentioned, means striving, struggling, making an effort. So for the Muslim, this could mean a spiritual struggle, overcoming your base desires, being a better human being. It can also mean a physical struggle in the sense that, you go out and get a university degree, you go out and earn a living for your family, etc. So any form of striving could fit the definition of the word jihad. Also, to be charitable is another form of jihad. To be able to look after the poor and the needy, those less fortunate than yourself, is also part of this definition of jihad. But we also see in the Quran that it's used in the sense of armed struggle as well. There are about 20 uses of the word jihad where the definition is open. It could be physical, and it could be militant, or it could be pacific. So we've got these different uses of the word jihad in the Quran. We also find this other word, qital. The word qital is used exclusively for fighting. And so we find this word used in most of the verses concerning war and peace in the Quran. I mentioned there's about 150 verses. Most of them are using this word qital rather than jihad. Now, to have a look at some of the Quranic verses where we find references to fighting or war and so forth. But we begin with this verse that says, "Have you not turned your attention to those who were told to hold back their hands from fighting and establish regular prayer and give regular charity?" This is a reference to the early period of Islam, the first 13 years while Muhammad was living in Mecca. Islam at this time had nothing to do with fighting, even in self-defense or any form of armed struggle. The instruction to the Muslims at this time in the Quran was, your religion is about establishing prayer and being charitable. And so there was no permission given to the Muslims to fight, even though they were being persecuted by the Meccans, the Quraysh tribe. It was only after Muhammad migrated to Medina in the year 622 that the Muslims were given permission to defend themselves. And this verse here is the very first verse that was revealed after this migration, this hijrah, in the year 622, where the Muslims were given this permission to fight. And the verse reads like this: "To those against whom war is made, permission is given to fight, because they have been wronged. And verily God is most powerful for their aid. Those who have been expelled from their homes in defiance of right for no cause except that they say, 'Our Lord is God.' If God did not check one set of people by means of another, there would surely have been pulled down monasteries, churches, synagogues and mosques in which the name of God is commemorated in abundant measure. Very interesting verse, because when we think about Islam, in fact, when we think about many religions, we think of them as being fairly exclusive. But what the Quran is saying here is that you have been given permission to fight to defend essentially monotheism, hence the reference to churches, synagogues and monasteries as well as mosques. So it seems as though in this early period what Islam was concerned about is that people being free to being able to practice monotheism in a society that was very staunchly polytheistic. So that's an important point to note, but I think that point is lost on many Muslims today, and it's certainly lost on those who belong to these various militant groups. Moving on and looking at what else the Quran has to say about, war and conflict and so on, we find these verses that suggest to us what the reason is for Muslims being given permission to fight. Fight in the cause of God those who fight you but do not transgress limits, for God doesn't love the transgressors. Slay them where you find them, turn them out from where they turned you out, for tumult and oppression are worse than killing. And fight them until there is no more tumult and oppression, there prevails justice and faith in God. But if they cease, let there be no hostility except against those who practice oppression. And another verse reads, and why should you not fight in the cause of God, and in the cause of those being weak and ill-treated, men, women and children, whose cry is, our Lord, rescue us from this town whose people are oppressors, and raise us from thee one who will protect, raise us from thee one who will help. So quite clearly, we're starting to get the sense that there is a theme here in respect to these verses on jihad or fighting or issues of war and peace, and that is people are given permission to defend themselves in response to the aggression of other people. Constantly we see in these verses references to oppression, people being driven from their homes and lands, people being denied the right to be able to worship as they please, etc. People being denied their basic human rights. These are the kinds of references we find in the Quran. Now the question is, is fighting an end in itself, or is it considered a means to an end? There are a whole lot of verses in the Quran that suggest it's a means to an end. We've got verses like this. If they, the enemy, incline towards peace, you too should also incline towards peace and trust in God. Verily he is all-seeing, all-knowing. Should they seek to deceive you with their show of peace, God is sufficient for you. And another verse reads, if they let you be and do not make war on you and offer you peace, God does not allow you to harm them. So we have these very clear verses that fighting is not an end in itself, but it's a means to an end. So if we look at all of these verses collectively, this 150 verses or so concerning war and peace in the Quran, we can see that there are three main objectives, or what we call in Arabic maqasid, for the translators, objectives. Three main objectives would be that fighting is not for any purpose, it is for the purpose of self-defense. It's for overcoming some sort of oppression, and the Quran mentions people being driven from their homes and land, being denied basic rights, including, the right to freely worship, one God. And also, we find another objective here, and that is establishing a just peace. And this is where we find these references to, oppression and people being entitled to their basic rights. If we look at how the Muslim armies evolve, I'm going to talk about this in a minute, we can see that at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, which is up until the year 632, we can see that Islam was basically confined to the western side of the Arabian Peninsula, and then a little bit here in the east as well. It was only after the time of the Prophet Muhammad that we see the expansion of Islam outside of the Arabian Peninsula. And you can see that his close companions, the first four caliphs, as they are known, and I'll talk about that in a minute, took Islam outside of the Arabian Peninsula into areas of Syria, into areas of Iraq, and also into parts of North Africa. Following that, we see the rapid expansion of Islam across North Africa, into Central Asia, all the way over to India, and all the way over to Spain as well. So we see a fairly vast territory come under Muslim rule within a very short period of time. We're talking in less than 100 years, a major section of that part of the world at the time. We're talking about the lands of the Sassanid Empire, as well as much of the territory of the Byzantine Empire, comes under Muslim rule. So we've got rapid expansion here. So in this context, it's necessary to look at the evolution of this concept of jihad, because it seems that this concept was a central tool of empires for the expansion of not necessarily Islam as a religion, although that did come later on, but certainly the expansion of Islamic rule or Islamic empires. So jihad becomes a tool of empire. And this is a consequence of the way particular scholars and rulers understood and interpreted the concept of jihad as described in the Quran. They looked at it as evolving in stages rather than looking at it in context. They didn't think that jihad is revealed in relation to this situation where the Muslims were already at war with the Quraysh and there was a need to defend themselves. They looked at this as progressively extensive permission from God for Muslims to be able to take control over all of the territory in which they encompassed. And so scholars have noted that it begins with no fighting, then it moves into fighting in self-defense, fighting for the spread of Islam against non-Muslims, and then it's fighting for the territorial expansion of Muslim lands. A couple of scholars, Shafi and Ibn Hazm, who are quite famous in Islamic history, were among the advocates of this idea. They basically said the Quran, the permission that Muslims are given to fight is not about aggression towards them. It's about fighting against people not because they're aggressive, but because they're non-Muslims, because of their faith or their lack of faith in Islam. And that was a fundamental shift from what we'd see described in the Quran. The Quran doesn't actually give Muslims permission to fight against people because they're not Muslims. It's giving them permission to fight because of their aggression. But this is lost on the perspective of scholars like these. They give primacy to what is considered to be the last verse of the Quran to be revealed concerning war and peace. This verse, verse 9:5, often referred to in literature as the sword verse, reads like this: "And when the sacred months are over, slay the idolaters wherever you may come upon them, take them captive and besiege them, and lie in wait for them in every conceivable place. Yet if they repent and take to prayer and render the purifying dues, then let them go their way, for God is much forgiving, a dispenser of grace." This is considered to be the last verse revealed in the Quran concerning, what is, generally referred to as jihad. And so primacy is given by some of these scholars to this particular verse. And as you can see, it appears to be quite, it appears to be advocating quite an offensive form of combat here. Other scholars, like Sarakhsi in the 11th century as well, advocated this idea of progressively increasing aggression towards non-Muslims in terms of fighting. He advocated a Quranic policy of warfare against non-Muslims according to 5 stages, beginning with trust, forgiveness and withdrawal, extending to preaching and inviting them to Islam, fighting in self-defense, aggressive fighting at certain times, and then aggressive fighting in absolute terms. And you get a version of this with what we've been hearing in respect to ISIS. They're confronting particular non-Muslim communities, basically saying to them, you've got the opportunity to convert to Islam here, or we're going to go to war with you. Those kinds of conditions. And they have an origin in this kind of thinking. How is it done? How is it that we read verses of the Quran that seemingly say that permission is given to fight in self-defense, yet what we see when we look at Muslim history is that it wasn't defensive but offensive? It basically revolves around this concept of naskh, or abrogation. That ultimately gave primacy to the sword verse that I showed you earlier. So essentially, we see a situation where 124 to about 140 verses are completely abrogated by the sword verse. And that includes all of those that say, if the enemy inclined towards peace, you too should incline towards peace. If they don't attack you, you don't have the right to attack them. Those kinds of verses are all abrogated as far as this thinking goes, leaving only the sword verse, which is interpreted as giving Muslims permission to attack people because they're non-Muslims. The validity that is cited is a couple of verses in the Quran which have actually nothing to do with this concept of verses abrogating other verses. These are actually about, you know, if you become a Muslim, you follow the Quran as opposed to if previously following the Bible, for example. They've got nothing to do with verses abrogating other verses. But what are the consequences? There was one scholar at the International Islamic University of Malaysia, his name's Isra Ahmed Khan. He did a major study on this concept of abrogation, and he said this is basically the consequence. According to the supporters of naskh, or abrogation, all the Quranic verses which extort believers to be just, fair, kind and soft in their dealings with non-believers are abrogated by two Quranic rulings, those in 9.5 and those in 9.29. If a society or a nation is under the influence of scholars believing in the sanctity of abrogation, its policies of international relationship will have two different provisions. One applicable to Muslim communities and nations, and another applicable to non-Muslim communities or people and states. This policy concerning non-Muslims will be based on hatred, contempt, intolerance and violence, as deemed to have been suggested by verses 9.5 and 9.29. With the state siding with those who reject this concept of, or this theory of abrogation as invalid, will found its foreign policy on the principles of justice, cooperation, kindness and softness as exhorted by all of those verses which are considered abrogated. It will apply the rulings of verses like 9.5 only in a situation of war with some formidable enemy who avowedly is trying to harm national peace, harmony, safety or security. We now move to, you know, a more modern era where we find the anti-colonial struggles around the 18th century to the 20th century. We see here Muslims returning to a more Quranic-oriented definition of jihad because they're no longer in charge of major empires and being able to use jihad for the expansion of their territory. They're using jihad here for the defence of their territory or the liberation from colonial rule. So national liberation struggles around the Muslim world used this concept of jihad. Also for the eradication of something that some scholars and leaders refer to as jahiliyyah. This is an Arabic word that means basically ignorance. So they were trying to remove what they referred to as un-Islamic elements from society, hangovers from colonial times. Also, we saw some Islamic revolutions take place, most notably the Islamic revolution that occurred in Iran in 1979, where jihad was used to advocate for people to overthrow, in this case, the Shah of Iran. And what was established in its place was an Islamic Republic of Iran. And also for the overthrow of Muslim rulers not deemed to be sufficiently Islamic. We've seen that take place in different parts of the Muslim world in the post-colonial era. As far as militant jihadists are concerned, we're talking here now in the 20th century and the 21st century. An important question is, why do they emerge in the first place? I would say one of the main reasons why we see Muslim militant groups or jihadist groups emerge is because of some foreign occupation or some bid for national liberation. If we take Palestine, for example, Hamas came into existence after 20 years of an illegal Israeli military occupation. I say illegal Israeli military occupation because that's how it's described by the United Nations, including the United Nations Security Council. Similarly, in Lebanon, Hezbollah came into existence as a consequence of Israel's occupation of Lebanon. In Chechnya, the Chechen rebels came into existence as a consequence of Russian occupation. In Iraq, the various groups that we hear of today were unheard of at the time of Saddam Hussein. These groups only emerged following the US occupation of Iraq. In the Philippines, there's a fairly long history here, beginning with Spanish colonial occupation, followed by American colonial occupation. And as a consequence of various policies of the Spanish, and then reinforced by the Americans, we had the emergence of groups like Abu Sayyaf and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. In China as well, we have in the Eastern Turkestan region, we have the Eastern Turkestan Islamic movement emerging. These are people who are not Han Chinese. They're ethnically different from the Chinese that most people would be familiar with. They don't see their lands as being part of China, although China certainly sees it that way. They're fighting for autonomy, and various policies of the Chinese government have led to, the emergence of this resistance group. Another factor in the emergence of Muslim militant groups or jihadist groups is political repression. And we can see this quite clearly in places like Egypt, with groups like Jamaat al-Jihad or Islamic Jihad. Some of you may be familiar with a group or a movement called the Muslim Brotherhood that emerged in Egypt in the late 1920s. Became a very popular grassroots movement that advocated for a higher observance of Islamic, duties, but also provided particular social services. And it became a popular movement not just in Egypt, but all around the Middle East and North Africa, and in the broader Muslim world, I would add. This particular group has, consistently been repressed by the government in Egypt. Many of its leaders have been imprisoned, tortured, executed, etc. And it was at the time of the execution of a leader by the name of Sayyid Qutb in 1966 that there was a splinter within the Muslim Brotherhood. The group had always advocated an evolutionary approach, that we continue to encourage people to be more religiously observant, we continue to provide social services, and eventually Egyptian society will become more Islamic, and that will bring about a change in leadership in Egypt. But what happened after 1966 was groups within the Muslim Brotherhood came to the conclusion that we're never going to achieve our goals through evolution. We're only going to achieve them through revolution. We need to take up arms here against the Egyptian government. And so these various groups emerged in response. Many of these groups have ceased to be, a recognised force in Egypt today, because many of them are either imprisoned or killed or went off to join other groups like Al-Qaeda, for example. But the context of the emergence of these groups is this political repression in Egypt. And we continue to see that going on today. The Muslim Brotherhood was, won the elections in the post-Arab Spring period, removed from power, and then, again, we can see a continuation of the repression of the Muslim Brotherhood. In Algeria, we have a situation that, is somewhat similar. After Algeria had historically been ruled by the French, and in the aftermath of French colonial rule, we see a political party, the FLN, take power. And they had ruled Algeria through its post-colonial history until 1990, when there were elections, and an Islamically oriented party called the FIS won those elections. They were denied the right to rule. Their members were arrested, thrown in jail, tortured, assets were seized, etc. And what resulted was a 10-year civil war in Algeria that led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. And many had to flee the country, etc. So again, it's this situation of political repression that has led to groups like the GIA in Algeria. Then in other cases, it's somewhat more perplexing. Countries like Pakistan, while Pakistan has had long periods of military rule, dictatorships, Islamic parties have always been part of the political landscape in Pakistan. The Jamaat-e-Islami, an Islamic party, was one of the founding parties of the state of Pakistan following the split with India. So Islamic parties have always been part of the process in Pakistan. So it's not because of political repression in this sense that we can explain the emergence of groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed, Harakat al-Mujahideen, or Lashkar-e-Toiba. They've emerged because of other reasons. And I would say part of the explanation has to be they've developed an extremist ideology that is informed by the kind of Islam that we see in Saudi Arabia. This Wahhabi Islam that's been imported into different Muslim countries, including Pakistan, in the form of Deobandi schools of thought. I don't want to overwhelm you with these terms, but the ideology of Islam that we find in places like Saudi Arabia plays a huge role in the development of these extremist ideologies we find in other parts of the world. In Somalia, groups like Al-Shabaab, I think, have emerged because of a similar extremist ideology. Indonesia is another good example. If we think about Indonesia, we can see that they had the reformasi movement in 1998, and following that we see the overthrow of Suharto, who ruled as in a form of a dictatorship for many decades. But now we see, post-1998, we see an opening up of the political process in Indonesia, and we see many Islamically oriented parties taking part in those elections post-1998. And so, we don't see the same factors at play here. So why would a group like Jamaat Islamiyah emerge? A group that also advocates this idea of a caliphate, although confined to Southeast Asia. So the three reasons that I put to you for the emergence of these jihadists or these Islamic militant groups are some sort of foreign occupation and a move for national liberation, political repression, or extremist ideology. But I think that it's important to have a look at some of the movements that developed around the Muslim world that have informed the way Islam is understood and in large part practiced by Muslims globally today. One of the most important movements was the Muslim Brotherhood. Essentially, the Muslim Brotherhood was a peaceful movement. It wasn't advocating the use of violence necessarily. It was a grassroots movement, as I said, encouraging Muslims to be more religiously observant, and also providing for various social welfare in the country. So providing people with loans, building schools, building clinics, etc. Those kinds of activities were a main part of the work of the Muslim Brotherhood. And we see even groups like Hamas in Palestine, which is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, do that same kind of work. Even Hezbollah in Lebanon historically has done that same kind of work. But I suppose the key idea that the Muslim Brotherhood advocated that became widespread all around the Muslim world is that Islam is the solution to all of the social, political, economic and other problems that Muslim countries are facing. There was a certain anti-Western sentiment within the ideas of the Muslim Brotherhood, and I think that that has provided some fertile ground for the us and them mentality, and also for this mentality that everything, all problems can be solved in Islam. Islam is completely self-sufficient. We don't need anything from the West. We need to return to following a strict Islamic law. We need to go back to the Quran and the prophetic traditions for the answers to our questions. That kind of thinking, I think, has provided fertile ground for many of the movements that we see today. But I think that the ideas of the Muslim Brotherhood were tempered by the fact that they weren't necessarily advocates of violence. Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the movement, advocated for an evolutionary grassroots approach rather than a revolutionary, violent militant approach. I think that probably the movement that is perhaps more central to the situation that we see today with the emergence of these violent jihadist groups is the Wahhabi movement that we see in Saudi Arabia. Because of the oil money that Saudi Arabia has, it's been able to export this ideology all around the Muslim world. This is done by building mosques in different countries, sending scholars to be imams in these places, providing scholarships to young people from all around the Muslim world, including Western countries like here in Australia, taking them to Saudi Arabia, educating them in institutions over there, then sending them back home. And so they've been able to spread this Wahhabi ideology all around the world. What is this ideology all about? Essentially, it began as a movement to purify Islam of what were regarded as un-Islamic elements. Islam is a strictly monotheistic religion, and this movement was strictly monotheistic. At the time that the movement emerged in the 17th century, essentially Muslims were engaged in what was described as the worship of saints, and that has no real place in Islam. that Muslims were not following the Quran and the prophetic traditions strictly. And so what Wahhabism did was basically bring a very strong puritanical literalist approach to Islam. And we see this quite clearly in, with ISIS today. If you look at a number of the things that ISIS are doing in Iraq, including the destruction of historical sites and other places of worship and so forth, this is akin to what the Saudis have done in Saudi Arabia through this Wahhabist ideology. The other group associated with this that you will often hear about is the Salafists, or this movement of Salafism. Not all Salafists are the same. Some of them are militant jihadists, like those that are in groups like ISIS. Others are political but non-violent, and you see some of the political parties in Egypt, for example, would fit into that category. They do advocate for the implementation of the Sharia law, and that's a whole other issue that I don't think we have time to go into now, but maybe during question time. And then you have others that are non-violent and apolitical. All they want to do is live sort of an austere life. They may present themselves, if they're men, with long beards, wearing robes, turbans, etc. Females may wear face veils. So they adopt a very strict, what they refer to as an Islamic lifestyle, but they're not interested in politics and they're not interested in violence. So there's different groups within the Salafists, but the ones we tend to hear about most are the militant jihadist types. Most scholars who have looked at groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and others agree that the movement that best represents them is probably a group that emerged early on in Muslim history, just after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, at the time of the fourth Caliph, and I'll come to explain this history in a moment. There was a major schism within the Muslim community, and there was a further offshoot that took place, and this group was called the Khawarij. They developed an extremist interpretation of Islam, where they said that anybody who commits a sin is out of the fold of Islam, and they become a legitimate target for violence. This includes those who were otherwise considered Muslim, as well as non-Muslims. And so, oops, my screen just turned off. But you've still got it there. There we go. Okay, and so the Khawarij, because of this declaration that they make of all others who don't subscribe to their view being non-Muslims and legitimate targets for violence, are very much like many of these groups we see today, particularly Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and others that are associated with them. So that idea of a complete disregard for human life, targeting people with violence, etc., has its origins at this time in the 7th century, just after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. I might pause for a minute here and just ask, are there any questions up to this point before we move on to talk about Caliphates? But there will be time for questions at the end. Robin? Yes. Yeah, good question, yeah. So all of these groups we're talking about are Sunni in origin. That's a very good question. Yeah.
It feels though like a lot of these groups think that through violence and anyone who commits a sin who is against Islam is out of it and deserves to be killed sort of thing. Do you think they legitimately feel that's a way that they can take over the world almost, like spread their knowledge?
Yeah, that's a good question. It doesn't seem as though they want to take over the whole world. It seems as though they're content with taking over all of those lands that were historically part of a Muslim empire, and I'll show you a map in a moment. Although Jamaat Islamiyah seems to have its sights on parts of Australia where Macassan fishermen used to visit in the 1600s, so we might have an issue there. Any other questions? Yes?
In that case, they only want to infiltrate areas that were historically significant. Why then do they feel the need to bomb in Spain or Australia or commit acts of terrorism? Because that is not conducive to converting us, because you don't really intend to influence people by bombing the country.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things tied up here. The bombing in Spain, I mean, one might say that Spain used to be part of the Islamic Empire, but that really wasn't the reason why the bombing occurred in Spain. It was supposedly to put pressure on the Spanish government to withdraw from Iraq. So there's a whole lot of mainly US foreign policy issues tied up here, and it's a response to those various policies and an attempt to have those policies changed essentially, or, you know, express grievance towards them. But I'll come back to that point, yes.
Could it be, is it obvious that, for example, ISIS don't really follow the teachings of Islam? Can that be argued? Because I'm Muslim myself, and I know myself that I'm supposed to live peace with non-believers of Islam, being Christian, Jew, or, for example, people who don't even believe in any
Yeah,
sort of religion.
yeah, absolutely.
Like, for example, Muhammad, both of his wives, two of his wives weren't even Muslim, but one was Christian, one was Jewish.
Sure.
I don't think people know that.
Yeah.
Many people know that. And
Right.
he worked peacefully with them as well. And
Yes.
these people came
Yeah.
to be Muslim.
That's an excellent point you make. And, you know, I think what needs to be said is that the absolute overwhelming majority of Muslim leaders and scholars and, you know, representatives all around the world, in the Muslim world and in the Western world, have condemned, you know, the actions of Al-Qaeda previously and, you know, of ISIS more recently. They don't, I mean, the overwhelming majority are saying, you know, these don't represent the teachings of Islam, which is why I mentioned, you know, the Khawarij, who historically have been regarded as people who have deviated from the essential teachings of Islam, and they regard groups like ISIS as more akin to these people than they do to any of the other legitimate understandings or interpretations of Islam. Thanks for those, and we'll definitely have, you know, more of a discussion at the end, I hope. Let's move on to talk about this concept of caliphates, because we've heard, you know, a fair bit about that in recent times, particularly with the rise of ISIS. You know, look, what's very important to note is that the word, there is no such thing as a particular political system as far as Islam is concerned. And I say that because, you know, in the field of Islamic studies, we would consider the Quran and most would say the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad to be the basic sources. And if we look at these sources, we don't find any blueprint for a political system in the Quran or in the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad. We have verses like this. And God said to the angels, "Behold, I will establish on earth one who shall inherit it." And the word Khalifa is used in reference to the one who shall inherit it. And we have, you know, human beings generally are referred to as Khalifa, or inheritors of the earth, in a number of other verses that I've mentioned here. Now, I think for all of you here, your reading of this is not that there's a particular political system mentioned here. It's simply saying that human beings are a superior species to other species that we find on the planet, and human beings have a responsibility to the earth and to, you know, social order on the earth. That's what the Quran is talking about here. There is no mention of any particular political system at all, especially not in reference to this concept of Khalifa. So where does the justification come from? What do they base their idea on that Islam is advocating for a particular political system that they refer to as a Khalifa? One of the verses in the Quran reads like this: "O you who have attained faith," or it's a reference to Muslims, "pay heed unto God and pay heed unto the apostle and unto those among you who is entrusted with authority. And if you are at variance over any matters, refer it to God and the apostle if you believe in God and the last day." That is literally the verse that people refer to say Islam advocates a political system called a caliphate. I mean, it's quite a vague verse. It doesn't even use the word Khalifa in that particular verse at all. And if you look at the way scholars historically have interpreted this verse, they say it's a general statement about, because Islam is a religion, according to the Quran, that provides people with basic guidance. The Quran itself says this is a book of guidance to all of humankind. And so guidance is needed by human beings in a whole range of different aspects of life. And so what this verse is referring to is, if you're seeking guidance, seek it from God, i.e. from the Quran, or seek it from the Prophet Muhammad, i.e. from his traditions, or those of you who have an understanding about things, who have authority. or have been entrusted to give this kind of advice. That's all this verse is saying. The fact that the people who advocate this idea of caliphate are clutching at straws like this should tell everybody that they don't have a very strong case. Let's have a look at Muslim empires as they evolve throughout history, and you'll understand this whole concept of caliphate much better. The term is first used after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. The Prophet Muhammad didn't leave behind any successor. But what he did do, he united the Arab tribes who had previously not been united in their history. He gave them a social system. He gave them social order. He gave them a concept of the rule of law. And he brought them together in a way where they might play some significant role in their own destiny, as opposed to being, at the mercy of the Byzantine on one hand or the Sassanids on the other. And so after Muhammad's death, they figured, well, let's not let this slip away. We have the chance to be somebody, on the map, so to speak. And so a group of the Prophet's companions met after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, and they discussed, what should we do next? And it was suggested that we need to appoint a leader here. And then it was suggested that this leader needs to come from the tribe of the Quraysh, because historically they have been the dominant tribe in Arabia. And it was suggested that a particularly close companion of the Prophet Muhammad, in fact the first person who converted to Islam, his name was Abu Bakr, that he should be the first caliph. He should be the first representative of the Prophet Muhammad, or the first successor to the Prophet Muhammad. And that is where the title came from. So this was something that was decided in a very ad hoc way by a group of Muslim people who were companions of the Prophet Muhammad after Muhammad's death. It's not as though they said, all right, Muhammad's passed away now, what are we going to do? Let's look up the Quran here to find out what political system we have to implement. No such thing, because there's nothing said in the Quran. When the story of this occasion is told, there's no Quranic verse mentioned. There's no prophetic traditions mentioned. It all happens in an ad hoc way. It all happens, according to circumstances. And so we see a situation where there are 4 what are referred to as Rashidun, or rightly guided caliphs. Abu Bakr is the first. He rules for 2 years. He passes away. On his deathbed, he appoints the second one, Umar, to be the second caliph. Umar rules for 10 years. He's assassinated. And then he's stabbed, and so when he's dying, he appoints a committee of 6, and he tells them, choose one from among yourselves. They choose one. His name is Uthman. He rules for 12 years. He's also assassinated. And after his death, the community basically elects the 4th caliph. His name is Ali. Just be a second. And so you have here 4 rulers, 4 different modes of election, 4 different modes of succession. None of these have any reference in the Quran or the prophetic traditions. It was all done according to circumstances. Yes? In the case of Umar, it was a Persian, no, it wasn't from the Muslim community, but in the case of Uthman, it was from disgruntled Muslims. There were disgruntled Muslims in Iraq, in Kufa and Basra, and in Egypt.
I took the question, I'm sorry.
Oh, the question was, who were the assassinators? So they came from these outer-lying provinces, descended on Medina, and a smaller group of them assassinated Uthman, the 3rd caliph. Ali becomes the 4th caliph, and here we go. Now, there was a question earlier about Sunni and Shia. All of this discussion revolves around Sunnis, because it's Sunnis that advocate the concept of the caliphate. We don't find this in Shiism. Shiism have a different system where they say the ruler of the Muslim community must be a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad through the family of Ali, the 4th caliph, right? So they have a different system. So all of this discussion is taking place in the context of Sunnis. And for those of you, just for your information, Sunnis make up the majority of the Muslim world. About 85 to 90% of the world Muslim population is Sunni, and a much smaller proportion is Shia. Today, Iran is a Shia Muslim state, but you also find significant populations of Shias in Lebanon, in Afghanistan, also in Pakistan, even in Saudi Arabia, Iraq, obviously, as well. Okay, so after the time of the Rashidun, this is considered the golden age or a glory period for Muslims. How so, really? I mean, you've got two of them were assassinated, and then civil war broke out at the time of the fourth caliph. He was then assassinated as well by the Khawarij, that group I mentioned earlier. So because Ali accepted arbitration, he accepted to sit down with his other Muslim enemies and have an arbitration. He was considered to have committed a major sin by the Khawarij, and then they assassinated him. Interestingly enough, ISIS has said that Hamas has delegitimized Hamas and said because they accepted a ceasefire with Israel, they are also worthy of being targeted with violence. And so they said, before we march on Israel, we'll be going after Hamas first. So exactly the same kind of thinking as the Khawarij back in the 7th century. So essentially what happened was, at the time of this fourth Caliph Ali, you have a split in the Muslim community. Those who backed the governor of Syria, his name was Muawiyah. He was the cousin of the third Caliph who got assassinated. There's his camp, and there's those who support Ali. Within Ali's camp, the group called the Khawarij broke away. So they are an offshoot of Ali's supporters, and they're the ones who eventually assassinated him. When he was assassinated, the rule of the Muslim world, or the Muslim community at the time, or the empire, passed to the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, Hassan. He wasn't really up for the task, so he abdicated, and Muawiyah, the nephew of the third Caliph, he becomes the ruler, and we start this new empire, the Umayyads. Most of these are now based on clans. The Umayyad was a clan of the Quraysh tribe, and so they take over rule, and they end up ruling from 661 until 750. It's during their time that the empire expands quite vastly. They're defeated in 750, but all is not lost because they had also conquered land in Spain. And so from 780 until 1031, they had a caliphate in Spain, and then subsequent Muslim empires continued to rule in Spain all the way up until 1492, when Granada fell to Ferdinand and Isabel. Back in the main part of the Muslim world, we have the Abbasid Caliphate from 750 until they were sacked by the Mongols in 1258. Simultaneously, we have other caliphates being established in North Africa, Syria and Egypt. This was the Fatimid Caliphate that lasted from 909 until 1171. Then we also have the Ottoman Caliphate from 1517 until 1924. I put 1517 there because that's when they ruled in the Middle East, as opposed to when they ruled in Central Asia or modern-day Turkey. Abdul Hamid II is an important character here because he revitalised the title of Caliphate for the Ottomans. The Ottomans, until his time, used it kind of ceremoniously. Salim I, who ruled in Egypt, used it, but then Ottomans after him didn't really use the title of Caliphate other than sort of ceremonially. They more used the title of Sultan. But Abdul Hamid II came back to the idea of using it and thinking of the Ottomans as rulers of the entire Muslim world. As you can see here, a lot of these empires are overlapping. So this idea of a single united Islamic empire or a caliphate ruled by a single ruler is actually the exception rather than the norm as far as Islamic history is concerned. And then you have others like the Mughals in India also using the title of Khalifa as well. So a range of different empires have used this, and we don't see a single unified Muslim caliphate other than in the time of the Rashidun. And this was a period that lasted from 632 until 661 and involved the assassination of 3 out of the 4 rulers. So hardly a great period from that perspective. So where do we get this idea of an Islamic system of government called a caliphate? Because what I've shown you here is it all happens in a very ad hoc way from a historical perspective. It gets legitimacy when various Sunni Muslim scholars from the 10th century through to from the 11th century through to the 15th century advocate this idea. And they make the argument that this is part of an Islamic system, it's a requirement in Islam, either due to on the basis of reason or on the basis of revelation. If they say revelation, they quote that very vague, obscure verse that I mentioned earlier, just here. And that's pretty much their only justification or evidence for this. So it's quite flimsy. But in any case, these are considered to be quite towering figures as far as Islamic political theory is concerned, particularly this guy al-Marwadi, who died in 1058. But these scholars have all contributed to this idea that the Caliphate is an Islamic system. And they present varying evidence, justifications and theories for this. But if you look at it overall, objectively, we can't deny the point that what happened in Muslim history happened in a very ad hoc way. There is no evidence in the Quran or in the prophetic traditions for a system called a caliphate. It's as simple as that. In 1925, an important book was written. This is a year after the abolition of the Ottoman Caliphate, so this is the end of the whole concept of caliphate in the Muslim world. This book was written by an Al-Azhar University scholar called Ali Abdul Razik, and he wrote basically a book that said exactly what I'm telling you today, that there is no Islamic basis for a system called caliphate. That in fact the Quran doesn't have a particular view about any particular political order, and this is open to people to decide for themselves what the appropriate political order is or should be. And it's interesting that a number of your contemporary Muslim political leaders, like Anwar Ibrahim, Recep Tayyip in Malaysia, Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, or Rashid Ghannouchi in Tunisia, are saying exactly the same thing, that we need a political system that reflects our needs. And it just so happens that democracies have proven to serve people best, in the modern world. And so that is a system of government that is most appropriate, rather than this kind of caliphate stuff that has, been part of history that really hasn't amounted to Muslim societies, being at the forefront of humanity, and certainly not today. In the colonial era, we do have a number of others, after the collapse of the Ottomans, we do have a number of others advocating for this idea of caliphate. We have Sharif Hussain bin Ali, who was supported by the British. The other thing here is that we often hear references to ISIS, in fact, being supported by Western powers covertly. And it's regarded as a conspiracy theory. If you think about it, we've got the Iraqi army ostensibly trained by the Americans and other allied forces, so they should be good soldiers, but they're getting their ass kicked by ISIS, who seemingly haven't been provided with this training. So why is it that ISIS is so good? Where do they get their training from? We know that the formations, the way they operate, are very sophisticated as far as Islamic militant groups go. So, where do they get their training from? Where do they get their weapons from is an important question that really is unanswered. And if we look back in history, we can see most of these Islamic groups, including those that resulted in the formation of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Sharif Hussain in Saudi Arabia as well, who fought against the Ottomans, all of them had been supported by Western powers, particularly the British. So that's a common thread, and that's a standard part of Muslim history and the history of Muslim militant groups. He was supported by the British against the Ottomans. He declared himself the Caliph of Hijaz, which is that western part of the Arabian Peninsula, in 1916, with British support. He was eventually defeated by Abdulaziz bin Saud, who established the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 1932. It's interesting to note that when he was defeated, the British sort of withdrew and let those two fight it out, and then they went and backed the King of Saudi Arabia. And then by the 1940s, we have the Americans backing Saudi Arabia in terms of ensuring or guaranteeing the protection of the regime in exchange for flow of oil. So that's fairly well known. Also in Egypt, we have others like King Fuad I, also advocating to become the Caliph over there as well. But of course, Ali Abdul Razik's book, written in 1925, put a damper on that idea to some extent. So we come today to various movements around the Muslim world that advocate for this caliphate. A group by the name of Hizb ut-Tahrir, with which you might be familiar. This is basically a non-violent group, but they do advocate for a global government ruled by a caliph, a system they call the Caliphate. Al-Qaeda similarly had a view that they wanted to restore the Caliphate. Jama'at Islamiyah had a view that they wanted to establish a caliphate in Southeast Asia. And then we've got ISIS, ISIL or IS, whatever you want to call them, also advocating this view today. It seems as though those, particularly Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Hizb ut-Tahrir, advocate a view that all of the lands that were historically part of a Muslim empire should be part of this caliphate. Interestingly enough, when this Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi declared himself a caliph back in June, none of the other groups accepted him as the leader, though. So the odds of this happening are, I would say, extremely low, because even though they're all advocating for this idea, none of them are in agreement with each other about it. So this is a map that shows you the Muslim world historically, and the parts that you see from across Spain and Portugal, across North Africa, including the Arabian Peninsula, and up into Central Asia, all the way over to India, these were historically part of the Islamic Caliphate. And you would have to extend that through Turkey into various parts of southern Europe here, because they were also part of the Ottoman Empire. So as you can see, this is the kind of territory that groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda are advocating for to be part of the caliphate that they envision. Any questions up to this point? We're going pretty well for time, so that's good. Yes?
So you don't feel that there will be anybody that can all agree on sort of things, that it's for a caliphate, there's no one that could release a corporate statement and all these groups would say, you may not necessarily agree, but at least listen to it?
No. First of all, these groups don't agree with each other, and that's why we do see them as distinct groups. Secondly, they don't have the support of the overwhelming majority of the Muslim world. Your average Muslim disagrees with them, and all of your Muslim leaders and scholars and so forth all disagree with them as well. So their ideas have been comprehensively rejected. The other important point to note is that, while the modern Muslim nation states really only came into existence basically from around the 1950s onwards, that idea of nation states, while new in the Muslim world, has become very much entrenched. And you see very strong nationalism has developed in most Muslim countries today. And so to change that structure of nation states to something more comprehensive like this, I don't think is palatable to the majority of Muslims around the world. And certainly the existing Muslim governments are not in favour of this. If you look at an organisation like the OIC, the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation, which is a transnational Islamic body. In fact, it's the largest transnational body after the United Nations, consisting of the world's Muslim majority countries. You can see in its constitution, the whole idea of nation states and their sovereignty is entrenched in the constitution of the OIC. So there's no space in that thinking for this historic, comprehensive Islamic world government sort of thing. It doesn't exist there. And I would say, beyond that, the key point is the majority of Muslims around the world, aren't in favour of this, and they certainly don't support militant groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS. Yes, up the back.
Again, the information you're giving is still providing the fact that these groups don't really follow the fundamental belief of Islam. Yeah, these groups don't even, they're believing that the theology of developing Caliphate, whereas Muslims don't, which is evident in teaching. So, and then you learned before, just the old slide that says, you mentioned that, the British, Western countries have been supporting these groups, and which these groups do follow the development of Caliphate. So, it's just maybe reading between the lines. Is it, I don't know, I'm just delving into conspiracy theories, but is it still the fact that maybe the Western countries still want to, control these areas in which they appear that they might get in trouble for doing so, you know what I mean?
Well, it's not a conspiracy theory to suggest that the resources in these areas are part of key strategic interests, in the Muslim world. If you look at the very first foreign policy document that was presented in 1992 at the time of Bush Sr. in the United States, this was the first time the US had an express policy towards the Muslim world. It's referred to as the Meridian House Address. And in that document, basically the United States makes it clear that it doesn't have a particular view about religion or Islam. And, it deals with nations irrespective of their religious, affiliation. But what it does say is the US foreign policy towards the Muslim world is based on 3 pillars. First one is oil, that the United States seeks to have secure access and flow of oil. The second thing is Israel, that the United States seeks to support Israel. And the third is, a much smaller pillar that is about human rights, women's rights, political pluralism, etc. Yeah.
So that does support that. They're saying that people say that the CIA is behind the ISIS movement. So what you're saying now to me is there's obviously a possibility that they might control ISIS. That CIA is controlling ISIS.
Sure. Well, I don't know. I don't have any evidence of that. All I can say is that if we look at it from an historical perspective, Western, governments and intelligence agencies have always been supporters of various groups or another in the Muslim world. They were backers of the Shah of Iran that brought him back into government when the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, was overthrown in a coup. They were backers of, Sharif Hussein in Mecca. They were backers of the Saudis. That's the history of the Middle East. There's always been a Western power that has supported the rise of these various groups, and so we shouldn't be surprised that groups like ISIS or whatever continue to have some support today.
Well, I'm not surprised, but
Yeah. Yeah. So it's entirely consistent with history. That's all I'm saying. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that. Any other questions now? Yes.
So can you just clarify the difference between Sunni and Shia?
Sure.
So it's not an ethnic difference, it's
No, not at all. Not at all. So they're historical. It goes back. The split begins at the time of the 4th Caliph Ali. There were those who said he should have been the first Caliph. They're the Shias, and those that said, well, it's entirely fine that he was the 4th. The major difference relates to leadership and succession. Shias say that the only legitimate leader of a Muslim, political entity has to come from the family of the Prophet Muhammad, and more specifically from the family of Ali. Sunnis say that's not necessarily the case. It could be anybody, who's a Muslim, who's, endorsed by the people more popularly, even though that idea of election really wasn't a constant in Islamic history. So that's the main difference. One relies on lineage and the other one doesn't.
So what was the issue in Iraq then that the government was a Shia government?
Right.
And somehow
Yeah.
the Sunnis...
Okay, so Sunni and Shia has become an important marker of Muslim identity in different parts of the Muslim world. That's the way we need to understand it. They're not fighting because, Ali should have been the first caliph. No, he was the 4th. That's got nothing to do with it. It's about when a government gets in power, how do they deal equitably with people? And so historically Iraq was ruled by Sunnis, and Shias were most likely marginalised during that time. Although some, were in positions of privilege, many were marginalised at that time. And so now when the situation has been reversed, we have a Shia government in power. Sunnis have felt marginalised since, the US invasion in 2003. And so this has led to the rise of groups like ISIS, who are able to appeal to their fellow Sunnis that, hey, we're getting an unfair deal here, and we need to, fight back against this government. Basically, we want our rights. We want to be respected as equal citizens. And so that is in large part the appeal of groups like ISIS, because they're seen to be defending the rights of Sunnis who feel as though their rights have been trampled on in the post-invasion period when a Shia government has come to power in Iraq. Yeah. Does that clarify it? And that's the same story in other parts of the Muslim world. In Lebanon, people felt as though their rights were not represented, their rights were not being met by one side or the other when the other was in power. Yes, Robin?
He was Sunni.
Who's that? Saddam Hussein was Sunni, yeah.
So for most of the time, it was the Sunnis in control.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, but certain Shias were in important positions within his government as well.
It's just
Yeah.
That they were, in the Islam days, they backed him, and then he backed him. Now they're not backing Sunni again. It's just...
Yeah. Yeah. It is all over the place, yeah. But you look where the oil wells are, and you get a sense of, where the strategic interests lie. Okay. Let's talk about appeal and recruitment. I have mentioned in my lecture today that the overwhelming majority of Muslims reject groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, etc. They regard what they're doing as, inconsistent and, entirely unacceptable as far as Islam's teachings are concerned. Particularly, the repression of minority groups, the killing of, minority groups, the way women are being treated, enslaved, and all of that kind of stuff, the killing of innocent people. All of this is rejected by the overwhelming majority of Muslims globally. That needs to be said. However, there is some appeal with groups like, ISIS and Al-Qaeda previously. And part of the reason is there are repressive Muslim governments, as we've just described. It's particularly in the case of Iraq. Sunnis feel as though their rights are not respected and that they're second-class citizens within their own country. If you think about what transpired after the Americans invaded, Sunnis were in a fairly, what we might say, privileged position at that time. But what happened was the Americans reversed all of that. They disbanded the army that was largely comprised of Sunnis. So these people were now without a job. They removed people, because it was more of a socialist system, they removed people who were managers of the various factories, who, in most cases were Sunnis as well. They no longer have a job. Laws were passed that marginalised Sunni people, and so they became targets then of the new regime, the Shias. And so repressive governments in the Muslim world play a very big role in why these militant groups emerge. If you look at the policies and practices of Israel towards the Palestinians, anyone who's been there or studied it, it will come as no surprise to you whatsoever that groups like Hamas should emerge. Originally, Hamas was a non-violent group, but after 20 years of an illegal Israeli military occupation, they said enough of this, and they combined their Muslim Brotherhood, social justice kind of ethics with the militant response, militant resistance of Fatah, and said, now we're Hamas, and we're going to fight against Israel, and we're going to try to liberate, our land. So the policies of governments play a big role in why, these various groups emerge. And that's the case all over the Muslim world. Whenever you see these groups emerge, look at the policies of the government towards them, and that'll go a long way to answer some of these questions. The policies of Western powers, foreign policies, are an important factor here. Why invade Iraq? Saddam Hussein wasn't the only dictator. Afghanistan, it wasn't the only, almost failing state. Why choose those? Look at the consequences of those kinds of policies. The interference in Muslim countries has led to quite dire results. A very good example is Iran. Iran had a democratically elected government back in the 1950s that was brought down by a CIA-engineered coup. Barack Obama himself has acknowledged this when he gave his famous speech in Cairo in 2009. And then since then, what was the consequence? The Shah came back in, quite brutal policies, the people rebelled, and we've had, since that time, the Islamic Republic of Iran. So there's so many examples where we see, these, Afghanistan is another good example. Okay, the PDPA in Afghanistan was a very progressive government, but had close relations with the Russians. So at the time of, who was the president? Brzezinski was was the Secretary of State at the time, and they decided let's invest $500 million in the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to destabilise the PDPA, and then as a consequence of that, the Russians entered, and then there was a war between the Afghanis and the Russians because we wanted to give Russia their own Vietnam. And what was the consequence of this? Eventually, the Taliban comes to power in Afghanistan. So there's been some really flawed policies in respect to the Muslim world, and they continue until today. But I think we also have to acknowledge that there is, if we look around the Muslim world, particularly at young Muslims in the West, there's an inadequacy as far as their Islamic education goes. Most of these people who find the groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda appealing really have a very limited understanding of Islam. If they do have any understanding at all, it tends to be a very puritanical, a very literalist interpretation informed by the Wahhabi ideology. Think about what Saudi Arabia has been able to do with its money. I mentioned about building mosques, but also publishing books and brochures, sending that all over the Muslim world, information on the web as well, training imams, providing scholarships to young Muslims to go and study in Saudi Arabia. Then they come back to their homeland, including places like Australia, and preach the Wahhabist ideology. This is how it gets spread around the world. In their thinking, there's a complete lack of focus on the higher objectives, on purpose, on values, on principles, and it's all a very literalist interpretation. Islam is not the only religion to suffer from this. Think about Christianity or Judaism. When you have literalist interpretations, you have these similar kinds of problems. But also, if you think about the way Muslims have imparted knowledge of their own history, there's been an emphasis on battles and wars, and Muslims are not the only ones to do this. I mean, Western countries celebrate, great wars and battles that we've, participated in, the glory of these kinds of occasions. But it's detrimental in terms of, how people see themselves and how they see the other. I mean, there's an issue here. Perhaps it's even an issue here in Australia, in our own society. There's apocalyptic prophecies that are all part of this. Here's a very interesting one that's been quoted quite widely since the rise of ISIS. This is attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, although, I think it needs to be said that most of the prophetic traditions are not reliable. Most of them, you would have to doubt the authenticity of them. Why? In the Prophet Muhammad's own lifetime, he forbade people from writing down prophetic traditions because he didn't want there to be any confusion between what he says and what was part of the Quran. And so his close companions who were writing down, statements he made and so forth, burnt their books that they had compiled of his own statements. So his ruling during his own lifetime was this is not to take place. It was a couple of hundred years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad that we start to see the compilation of these prophetic traditions. I mean, it's very difficult. If you knew someone that passed away 10 years ago, how difficult is it to quote from what they had said or to pass on, what they did or what they said? It's extremely difficult. And we're talking like 200 and 300 years after the death of Muhammad that Muslims supposedly are able to now, restate what happened at the time of the Prophet Muhammad. If you look at these statements, these hadith, a lot of them are politically motivated. One of the main narrators of these hadith is a person by the name of Abu Hurairah. He was a companion of the Prophet for only 2 years. The closest companions of the Prophet Muhammad regarded him as a liar and someone who wasn't to be trusted. Yet a large proportion of the prophetic traditions that are accepted by Sunni Muslims come from this guy, who Umar, a close companion of the Prophet, or Aisha, the wife of the Prophet Muhammad, regarded as someone who wasn't trustworthy. And this is a key part of Sunni Islam today. So if you look at the prophetic traditions, there are huge problems with them. And the bigger problem here is that Muslims base a lot of their understanding of their faith on these prophetic traditions. In fact, oftentimes much more so, they base their understanding of Islam on the Hadith than they do on the Quran. So you've got these traditions, like if you see the black banners coming from the direction of Khorasan, basically Central Asia, join that army even if you have to crawl over ice. You've all seen pictures of ISIS. What do they look like? They got the black banners, they got the seal of the Prophet Muhammad on them. So they're playing into this mythology. And they're making reference to prophetic traditions like this to sort of say, we are the people that the Prophet Muhammad foretold. If you can even go to websites of people who are otherwise, fairly well-meaning Muslim scholars who have compiled all of these kinds of prophetic traditions, these apocalyptic prophecies, and have assembled them in relation to what's been happening with ISIS, to say ISIS is the foretold group by the Prophet Muhammad. And so many young Muslims are quite confused. I mean, others are sitting back saying, well, if that's the Islam that is advocated, I don't want anything to do with it. And others are saying, well, if that's the if that's the prophecy, then there must be something good in ISIS, and maybe what the media is presenting is nonsense, is untrue. And keeping in mind, you know, many Muslims are quite sceptical of media representations given their experiences with it over the past, you know, decade or so post 9/11. And the other issue we come to here is Islamophobia. You know, that's something that I think is sometimes overstated, but, you know, is a real concern, particularly in Western societies. Many Muslims feel marginalised or alienated. And if we think about post 9/11, obviously many young Muslims will have some identity issues. They feel as though they can't be accepted by Western society, they feel marginalised, they have religious leaders who reinforce this idea of us and them, they have political, you know, our politicians get up there and say these things that make Muslims feel on the defensive. And so, you know, these are part of the reasons why groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda have some appeal. When you put all these factors together, it should be no surprise that a small proportion, albeit a small proportion, find appeal with groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, etc. Now, just to sum up, Jihad, that we spoke about right at the beginning, means to strive, struggle, make an effort. In the context of armed struggle, it was confined to self-defence, as far as the Quran is concerned. It was after the death of the Prophet Muhammad that jihad became a political tool for empire, for the conquest and expansion of Muslim territory. This didn't necessarily mean that all people in all of these territories became Muslims. That often happened hundreds of years later. But what we did see was the political expansion of Islam as a political order, as a social order to some extent. Non-Muslims and un-Islamic Muslim rulers became primary targets of this new vision of jihad. The concept of Caliphate, as I've explained to you, has no basis in the Quran or the prophetic traditions as a political system. It was invented by later Muslim scholars based on their interpretation of history. So they looked back at what happened during Muslim history, and they came to the conclusion that this now has an Islamic basis. It has an Islamic justification because towering figures like Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman and Ali, you know, were the first caliphs. This kind of idea. A range of social and political factors today drive the contemporary jihadist and caliphate groups. And I think we need a deeper understanding and investigation of these factors in order to have a better understanding of these issues of jihadist and caliphate groups that we're encountering. Thank you.